So I wanted to make a quick video about the X-Mid versus a pyramid shelter, especially relating to winter use, just because I've been getting that question pretty often lately, which makes sense because I have a bunch of videos about the pyramid shelters, and then I've been using the X-Mid this winter and throughout last year for my summer shelter. So I have a lot of experience with pyramid shelters. I started using them in around 2010. I had the Mountain Laurel Designs Speed-Mid, which was a very low shelter. I think it was 9x9, but you could use a single trekking pole at fully extended, so about 48 inches high. That is too low. It doesn't have much usable space in it. The angles are just too shallow. So I used it for 2 or 3 years, and I just found it kind of frustrating because it was so big but so low and such shallow angles. Later I got an O'Air 9x9. O'Air is one of the original cottage companies that makes their main product is a pyramid shelter. I used the O'Air for a season or two, and then I switched to the MSR Front Range just because I got it used. It was a great price, and it has a little bit more refined build than the cottage company O'Air pyramid. I've also camped in the Hyperlite Mountain Gear Ultimate 4 with Justin. And then last year I used X-Mids extensively. I only camped with X-Mids for most of last year and then throughout this winter. So I've got a good feeling of both. Now the reality is, in terms of sort of macro performance, they're very similar. They take up a very similar amount of space. So a 9x9 pyramid is a big shelter. You need a lot of space. The X-Mids require quite a bit of space too. Obviously the 2-person X-Mid is about 9 feet along the long side and a little bit less along the shorter side. The 1-person X-Mid is a little bit smaller. So you need a big space for both. Setup is very similar, and ultimately weight is fairly comparable. I'm gonna say that the X-Mids are a little bit lighter. So my 2-person X-Mid comes in at 22 ounces, whereas a similar material pyramid is closer to 30 or 32. There just seems to be less material. So that's definitely a little bit of advantage. So you get a big shelter, lots of space, fairly light compared to the similar sized or similar priced and material pyramid. Now that's if you're only using the fly. So I'm really talking about these as one versus the other, the same sort of use case where you're using a single wall floorless shelter pyramid or the X-Mid fly. The X-Mid obviously comes with an inner, so you got a different setup there, but I'll get into that after. So in terms of the overall, the macro scale, there's not a huge difference. If you can set up a pyramid, you can set up an X-Mid. There's a little bit of a learning curve there. Why am I using the X-Mid more right now? Well, there's 2 main reasons. The first one is just a use case. I find that you get a lot more usable space in the X-Mid because you've got the 2 poles. So you have your roof, the ceiling, the ridge line is at that maximum height of the 2 poles all the way across. Whereas a pyramid has a higher pole, but there's only that little area around that pole where it's really quite high. The pyramids, it depends on how high the pole is too. So something like the sort of a standard height is about 65 inches. The Front Range is that height. Black Diamond Megalite is that height. The Hyperlite Mountain Gear Ultimate is 75 inches. It's quite a bit higher. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. For me, the X-Mid with my use case has a lot of things going for it. So that higher ceiling, 2 doors, which is nice, depending on how you set up. If the wind changes, the weather changes, anything like that, you got 2 options to get in. The maximum height is close to your head if you're sleeping with your shoulder near one of the poles, versus a pyramid where it's typically in the middle of your body. So the pyramid, that fly is right near your face. Those 2 doors, when you're lying down, the walls are a bit steeper, so you can just reach out, open a door, shut a door from lying down or sitting up. Whereas in a pyramid, you've got to kind of crawl out, reach pretty far to get up to that, to get to the zipper. If it's snowing, you'll generally want to bash some of the snow off before you open. But with the X-Mid, you can roll up the door. It can be snowing a bit or raining a little bit, and you generally get protected inside the shelter. Whereas with the pyramid, once you open that door, you know, the weather's coming in, rain's coming in, snow's coming in, and if you don't quite bash enough snow off of it, once you open that door, it falls in the tent. In terms of a pyramid, I'm not going to say that it's a bad shelter. They're great shelters, and there's definitely some use cases. One of the best ones for me is if you're going to be 2 people or more, potentially. So, you know, I'll splash up an image of how we were sleeping when I used the Ultimate 4 with Justin, and you get a pad widths of space between the 2 people. So, you know, you're not brushing up shoulders with your buddy as much as if you're going to be 2 people in an X-Mid. Whether you're using an X-Mid 1 person or 2 person, there's definitely room for 2 people in the 2 person, not in the 1 person. The 2 person, there's room for 2 people, but you're going to be close together. If you go to a 9x9 pyramid, they're sold as 4-person shelters. Realistically, sleeping in there in the winter, I think they're big 2-person shelters. And something like the Ultimate that has that high peak, you actually have more room than I was expecting. So that was one of my concerns going in to use the Ultimate. I generally speaking sleep kind of skewed off to the side to get as much usable height above my face and feet. And we were going to be 2 people in that shelter, but that 75-inch height gives you a lot steeper walls and a lot more room. So I can sleep, you know, perfectly along the length, no issue, not too close to either of the walls for my head or feet. And you get that space in between each person, just with the tent set up on the ground, not doing any serious digging. That's the other part of the pyramid. If you start digging, you can make a pretty crazy setup as a kitchen tent or a long-term winter shelter, bed areas, a table area, all kinds of stuff. I think that would be a little bit more challenging to do with the X-Mid. It doesn't lend itself to that kind of excavation and center pole and things like that. So, you know, if you're going to be using a tent long-term in the winter and you're somewhere where there's a lot of snow, you can really do some neat stuff with the pyramid. So that's why I've been using the X-Mid in terms of usability for 1 person, whether it's the 1 person or 2 person. For most people, the 1-person X-Mid as a single wall winter shelter fits. I'm on the taller side, so the 2-person gives me a little bit more space, but I've used the 1-person as well, and there's plenty of space in there. The other reason I've been using the X-Mid is just to show what you can do with that tent. A lot of people own the X-Mid, less people own pyramids. And what it's showing is that you can go out and do winter trips with the X-Mid. It's a fantastic shelter. Pyramids are, I find, a little bit more of a specialty item. Should you go out and buy another winter shelter if you already own an X-Mid? I don't think so. I've shown it. You can do some pretty fantastic trips with the X-Mid, and it's a relatively inexpensive tent. They're right around $300 for either the 1-person, 2-person solid or mesh in Sil Poly, and you're getting a super versatile shelter. If you go to something like the Black Diamond Megalite or the MSR Front Range, or even something like the Mountain Laurel Designs Super Mid, I can't remember the name, they're quite expensive, and you're getting a very, very specific type of shelter. I just find people less interested in those. You know, I've tried to sell some of them recently, and it takes a little bit more time. You're getting a pretty solid hit on your investment. If you move up to something like the Hyperlight Mountain Gear Ultimate 4, that is an $850 tent. Super light, super well made, but wow, that's a lot of cash, and you don't get an inner for that $850. If you want to get the inner, you're up to $1,000-something tent. That's a very, very niche tent that less people are interested in using. So ultimately, the X-Mid was because I wanted to show what you can do with some gear that's really available and really versatile. You get an X-Mid 1-person tent, and you've got a great summer shelter, great winter shelter for certain conditions. Now, obviously, this isn't for polar expeditions or climbing Mount Everest or some crazy mountaineering, but for some pretty challenging conditions, you've got a great shelter. I also just want to point out that the 1-person or 2-person Pro X-Mid is not what I would consider the ideal winter shelter. You can 100% use it. I would use the Pro if it didn't have that mesh inner. It's just something that I don't want to deal with in the winter. You know, you're accumulating a lot of frost You don't need a bug net in the winter. If I could get the 2-person DCF X-Mid with no inner, just the fly, you'd have this crazy light, probably 12-ounce shelter that would be able to handle some pretty wild conditions. That's the kind of long-winded answer to why I've been using the X-Mid versus pyramids. They're both great shelters. They have their place. I think the X-Mid is just a little bit more versatile and more useful for most people for a lot of different conditions. If you like this kind of video, quick answer to some questions in the comments, just give it a thumbs up. It's something I'm going to be working on a little bit more. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, it really does give me some positive feedback that this type of content is useful to you.